Good afternoon. I'm Christina Elson, the Executive Director of the Center for the Study of Capitalism at Wake Forest University. Thank you for joining us today for our discussion about media bias in America. This panel is part of a series about the future of capitalism, and if you'd like to learn more about that series, you can go to capitalism.wfu.edu to find more information, and you'll also find links to join our social media community. So today our panel is going to share their thoughts on a particular theme. We're going to talk about media bias and whether this has become so pronounced in our country that it undermines not only our politics, but our capacity to conduct business. Is it possible for us to move beyond what some perceive as chronic tensions between left or right, or are the economics of media turning us towards a model where bias equals revenue? As always, I'm joined for these panel discussions by Richard LEVICK, my good friend, who is also the chairman and CEO of LEVICK, an executive affiliate with the center. Richard, hello.
Christina, thank you. And thanks for putting so much emphasis on, as always. I now know what an albatross feels like, but thank you so much. It is an honor to be here. Let me very quickly introduce the panel. And first, let me introduce Kurt Bardella, who will join us momentarily as another engagement is running right up against this live interview. Kurt's a regular contributor to MSNBC, USA Today, and other media. He was a senior analyst and consultant for any number of other media, including USA Today, and also worked in senior positions in both the House and Senate, and the Republican majority in the House, and for Olympia Snowe on the Senate side. He's also now a member of the Lincoln Project. Alice Stewart, who is a CNN political commentator, a communications consultant, veteran senior advisor on communications for numerous presidential campaigns, an Emmy Award winning journalist, contributor to NPR, and a fellow at the Institute of Politics at Harvard, where I understand you were able to squeeze Michael in as well, but it took a lot of work and a $20 bill, I think, to make that happen. Michael Zeldin, also an old friend, a CNN legal contributor. And you go back around 25 years, as I recall, O.J. Simpson, Whitewater, Monica Lewinsky, and any number of the other high-profile issues that you covered, the Clinton impeachment. You're a former U.S. Department of Justice official, and also, as I mentioned, a fellow at the Institute of Politics at Harvard. Ray Locker, who is the Washington Enterprise editor of USA Today, overseeing the coverage of the White House, the military, money and politics, of which I understand there are none, so that probably is a pretty slim beat, and the Supreme Court. And I'm hoping, Ray, at some point you get busy, because those clearly aren't very in-depth topics. I know that you've written two books, one about Richard Nixon and one about Haig. So, and I know the Nixon book is most recent. So welcome all to the program. We're delighted to have you here. And with that, Christina, I turn it back over to you.
Yeah, so right before we went live, we got into a great discussion about defining the term media bias. So is the media really biased, and what do people want out of the media? And we know that to some degree, people do look at media outlets to help confirm or acknowledge their belief, whereas there are other people that have a strong view that media should be very impartial and it should be about informing and educating. So let's just start with this idea of term definition. And Michael, why don't we go right to you? Tell me what when I say media bias, or when you read media bias, what are you thinking?
So for me, bias is a pejorative term. It doesn't mean one having an honest opinion. And so one says the media is biased, or to use the president's language, it is fake news. It implies that it's not to be trusted, that there's no trustworthiness that underlies it. And I don't agree that the media is untrustworthy. I do believe, however, that the media has moved from sort of 10-10 wins New York, just the straight reading of the AP wires, or Walter Cronkite telling us that's just the way it is, to opinion-based television. And we see that, I think the advent of that was with Fox, and I think the other stations have followed suit. So I'm not sure that there's anything wrong with opinion television, but one has to understand that that is what it is, and it is not necessarily fact-based, but rather it is just one's interpretation of the data that's available to them. And I think that the economics of cable television certainly is going to keep us in the opinion television realm, because people tend to listen to what they want to hear, and they therefore tune into those who are preaching to the choir.
Alice, you've worked on any number of Republican presidential campaigns. You've worked up close and personal, both on the political side, continuing as a consultant, and also as a noted journalist. What are some of the key changes you've seen from past administrations in terms of the way this administration communicates?
Clearly, the advent and use of social media. This administration, with a large social media following, uses that to communicate the White House message. And, you know, we hear from the president often that the reason he tweets and the reason he does communicate via social media is because he feels as though his message is muddled or misrepresented or fake news, or the filter of the news media takes away from the message that he wants to use. And so he is very effective in using social media to communicate directly with the people. I've seen over the years just the advent of Twitter, and the 24-hour news cycle puts much more pressure on reporters to come up with more content, and the competition between news outlets and reporters to scoop someone else or to break news or to get a new headline. The increased pressure with the additional 24/7 demand from social media does often lead to misrepresentations of stories. It does lead to taking things out of context without fully being able to vet the information. So I think while there's a lot of advantages to the 24-hour news cycle, it does create a lot more opportunities for misinformation. I think that's been a big change. But with that, a lot of people know where they go to get the information they want. They like oftentimes the silos of ideology. If they go to Fox News, they know what kind of content they're going to get there. If they go to CNN or MS, they understand the content they're going to get there. But I think it's really important, and I stress oftentimes with my students is, where news is. You know where to go get actual news. You know where to go get opinion commentary. And I always recommend it's like a buffet. Grab a little salad, grab some meat, grab something from each side, and make up your own mind and look at all the facts, distinguish between facts and feelings, and make up your own mind and base your own opinion based on that. Because there's a lot of opportunities to subscribe to a certain kind of ideology or mindset. But I think the best thing is to read everything and see everything you can and use your own. Really boils down to just common sense.
So Christina, before I turn it over back to you, let me ask a follow-up question. I'll direct this at Ray. And Alice, let me try and summarize 2 points in the form of a question for Ray. One, you emphasize, or I interpreted what you said as emphasizing a lot of the evolution of where we are in media because of media, the 24/7 nature, starting with CNN back 35 years ago and to today, where I've heard of this program called Facebook. I don't know if anyone else is familiar with it, but the constant always on. So that being one element. And the other issue you suggested was that we all be smart consumers of communications. But I wonder, Ray, one, if you would argue, is it just hey, Kurt, we'll introduce you, we'll welcome you in just a moment. Great to see you. Ray, the 2 questions I was going to ask you was, one, What's the evolution you see from the Nixon administration, a genius in terms of how he used the media, with the exception of his Nixon-Kennedy debate in the only election he lost for national office, in terms of where we are today? How do you see that arc, that evolution? And two, our epistemology has changed. Alice makes a very important point of our responsibility of grabbing information from all sources, but many of us don't seem to do that. We seem instead to draw our conclusions first and then only go to sources that confirm that. Ray, I'm going to turn that over to you and just want to officially welcome Kurt Bardella. Thanks so much for joining us. We did introduce you earlier, Kurt, and we knew that you were running late. So glad you could join us. Ray?
Appreciate it.
Well, claims of media bias have been with us forever. They were certainly there during the Nixon administration and during Nixon's campaigns. He believed that the media were out to get him. I don't agree with that. I think the bias is in the media in terms of reporters and editors, is they can tell when somebody is not being truthful or being dodgy, and they focus on that. And it's gone on from there. I mean, I've been accused of being biased by everybody all over the spectrum in terms of, the work that I've done. Mostly it's because they don't like what you're doing. And if they claim that you're biased, it's a way to get you back on your heels so you don't do the reporting that you're supposed to do. And, we've seen that from every administration, certainly before Nixon, during Nixon, and afterwards. I mean, Lyndon Johnson told us the war in Vietnam was going great. So did JFK, and he went after David Halberstam in the New York Times because he wouldn't get on the team. Look, we're paid to have judgments of our own. We're paid to be neutral in a lot of different ways, and, to determine the facts for ourselves and tell people that. What's made it difficult now is that this president tells so many falsehoods that when you report on that objectively, then the claim is that you're being biased. And it's a way to discredit what we do. It's what he told Leslie Stahl a few years ago, which she repeated on Sunday on 60 Minutes. It's a way to get you off balance. And, if I was in that position, I would probably do it too, but it's our job to resist that.
So it sounds like, what we're hearing is that there's really no point in telling media outlets that they need to provide a neutral stance, because consumers don't necessarily want that. But what, as Alice has pointed out, it's important to tell consumers is that there are a variety of opinions and perspectives, and you really need to be able to discern critically among them. So, building on that, Kurt, maybe you would help us understand, do you think that, studies by people like Pew earlier this year already brought a lot of this out, that Republicans tend to go to fewer sources, Democrats tend to choose from more sources. Do you think this is becoming even a more fixed perspective, given what's happened this year since March and the election and everything else that we're experiencing?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the real changes, and this is really how technology has changed how we consume news, and that we now have platforms where we can limit ourselves to only see the feeds and stories that those in our own social circle, those who are like-minded, see. We can choose to be one-sided, and we can choose to only get one perspective. And when the only thing you're being fed is one perspective, your entire worldview is going to be predicated only on that. We have a time now where there is something for everybody, whether you believe in conspiracy theories or facts or somewhere in between, whether you're right, left, middle, not interested at all. There is something for everyone's media consumption diet that fits their way of life and fits their worldview. And people seem less and less interested in trying to understand the other side, trying to really get into, well, why does someone who I might disagree with, how did they arrive at their set of beliefs? Let's dive into that. Everything is so superficial and clickbaity and meant to only capture your attention in 220 characters or less. And we have less diversity of thought because of that. I think when we approach the question of bias, I feel like it's not necessarily that there's a left and right bias. I mean, sure, there are platforms who consciously decide to only tell the story through a particular worldview on all sides of the ideological spectrum. That's true. But I feel like that the bias now that exists, particularly in journalism, is less about ideology and more about bias towards your own network of sources and relationships, that you are more likely as a journalist to tell the story a particular way if it's presented to you a particular way by a source that you know, that you trust, that you built relationships with. So many of the stories that people would deem that are negative or opposition, well, those stories are generally fed to somebody, and the person who is receiving that, it's transactional, because you're, as a former press person, as a former press secretary who used to dole out information and documents and things that were sought after, I inherently knew that whoever I chose to give the goods to, they were going to write the story more favorable because I'm choosing them. I could give this to anybody. Everybody would want emails from the Secretary of the Treasury that we subpoenaed that I now have in my hand. So the bias isn't necessarily anti-Republican, anti-Democrat. The bias is pro your source, and it does influence the way that the story is being told and presented to the public at large.
Kurt, let me follow up start with you and then open this up to the panel. One of the things I was always concerned about with when George W. Bush and the prosecution of the war in Iraq was the claim to bring democracy there when you have tribal country, Shiites and Sunnis. Democracy in a country that is largely tribal is exceptionally difficult. And yet here we are a decade and a half later, and we have become exceptionally tribal. And you talk about it not being left, right, or Democratic or Republican. How do you see communications in a tribal venue now?
Unfortunately, it's as a tactician and from a strategic standpoint, you whatever side you're on, you want to motivate and motivate your side and agitate the other. You are inherently and deliberately playing up conflict because that's what gets your side excited, and it has an impact on the other. I think in many ways, I'm a senior advisor to the Lincoln Project, and a lot of what we have done has been deliberately focusing on ways to occupy the headspace of one person on this planet, and it happens to be the person who makes the world go around right now, Donald Trump. But our goal is to agitate, and through that agitation, have an amplituary effect that reverberates all across the political spectrum. I think that the weaponization of tribalism is what I call it. That has become the tool that everyone is using across the entire spectrum now. And again, it has little to do with I think bias, but just acknowledging that the bias that exists for the audience now it's an information bias. It's bias that I'm only going to seek out what I want to know and what I care about and what I agree with. And our goal and our challenge as strategists is to try to meet those people there, get information to them where they are consuming it, and try to get them to consider something outside of that bubble that might move their opinion or agitate, incite, or excite them.
Part of the challenge with doing one of these webinars with all polite people is that no one wants to shout over the other. I'm just so disappointed that you're all so polite. But Alice, do you want to weigh in next?
Sure. I think it's important to recognize. I mean, Kurt brought up some really great points about tribalism and how it's really been magnified lately. But I always find it really important to stress to people to keep in mind when we talk about the news and whether there's media bias and whatnot. The thing with news, it's the news business, and it's called a news business for a reason, because they're there to make money. And I have a strong faith and belief in the majority of journalists out there covering the White House, your colleagues at USA Today, right? Journalists by nature, they get into this business because they want to be fair and impartial, and they want to present both sides of the story, and they want to pursue truth, justice in the American way as a journalist. And that's what I did when I was a journalist. But collectively in a news organization, when they're having their editorial board meetings in the morning, they're looking at, what's going to sell papers, what's going to put butts in the seats to watch the evening news, what's going to get more clicks. And in terms of their viewership or their tribal followers from a political leaning, what do their viewers want to see more? Do they want to see more COVID? Do they want to see more trashing Trump? Do they want to see, more Biden? And then the news outlets are going to provide the content that is going to bring in more of the type of viewers that they have. And it's frustrating from Trump's standpoint oftentimes, because he sees it, what he calls it, fake news, just because it's unfavorable. I think there's a big distinction. But I think what we're seeing more and more is that journalists by nature want to be fair and accurate and follow up and hold politicians accountable. But oftentimes you have the editorial boards and the editorial decisions being made based on what is part of a business structure that they have to boost their ad revenues. And oftentimes that may not be the most fair way to go about presenting the news, but at the end of the day, they're there to make money as well.
That's such a good point. Like, you are so spot on. Like, if you ask any journalist what, outside of Donald Trump, the number one story going on in the world, many of them, and I just had this conversation a short while ago, many of them would say, what's happening to our planet right now, climate change. You talk to any producer or network executive, why they don't cover that more, it's because it doesn't rate well.
News organizations track what people read. They have so many different metrics to use. And a lot of times the decision to what you're going to cover is determined by that. And so if you've written 4 stories about climate change and you can tell that no one's reading it, you adjust your thinking in terms of what you're going to do and how you're going to make people read it. That doesn't mean you don't write about it, but you have to adjust how you do that and find different ways. People don't read process stories like they used to either. So if you're doing, like, say, an 8 to 12 inch story about some incremental thing, people don't read those. So it forces you as a journalist to come up with different ways to frame that story and make it something that people care about. One of the things that I always tried to do as an editor is to use data and streams of information that are usually not touched by a spokesman. So like, Kurt might give somebody something. I don't like to get information that way. I like to notice trends through data that come from government agencies and say, I've seen enough of these reports to know that there's a trend here, to analyze that data and then go to the spokespeople and say, hey, we've noticed this. Like in Iraq, we noticed that 2/3 of all US troops in Iraq are getting killed by roadside bombs. What are you doing about it? And that gives the journalist a little more authority in terms of how to shape that coverage. So you're not necessarily influenced by people who have an agenda of what they're trying to promote.
Yeah, that takes work, and work takes time. And one of the problems that we have is the timeline from sort of acquisition to reporting has shrunk. And so if you're a working journalist and you know that there's competition to get something out there first, taking the additional time rate to look at the data may not be a luxury you can afford from that business standpoint. There also is, I think, and Kurt, we talked about it just before you came on, what I was saying is that TV, especially cable television, has become opinion television. It is not a fact-based organization. And you can look at the numbers between when Hannity comes on versus the show that just precedes him. People click out when the news is the news, and they click in when the opinions are being offered. And distinguishing between, I think one of the great failings in media these days is that they present opinions as if they're facts. And
Right.
There's a great deal of confusion in the listening audience. It's almost as if it should say advertisement or infomercial or something that says, this is this person's opinion. It may not be, it's like when I write, when and Alice and I would write for, CNN.com or anything else, would say the opinions expressed here are not necessarily those of
Right.
CNN.
CNN, yeah.
And in some sense, you want to say the opinions expressed by Sean Hannity or Rachel Maddow, we pick your person, are not necessarily fact-based.
Yeah.
And if you want fact-based opinions, go to raise data sets, and look into it. But that's delusional. And so if you're an advertiser with a product to sell, you got to figure out, what's your responsibility with respect to these outlets that are not really intending to present a two-sided portrayal of a story.
Yeah.
The funny thing too is that Fox News doesn't make any disclaimer about its primetime lineup being all opinion, but when a lawsuit comes, they are in court saying, well, these people they're basically entertainers. They should not be held liable for the things that they say publicly on the airwaves that are untrue. And it's like, wouldn't it be nice if you made that same disclaimer before your show every night? Because Michael, you just said, they presented as fact. They presented it as the be all end all, and their audience accepts it as such. Their audience accepts it as gospel. Despite the fact that it'd be so interesting to see what all of these people who watch, like I said, whether it's Tucker Carlson or Rachel Maddow or whoever, if they knew that, that very day, their lawyers were in court arguing that they should not be held to a journalistic right or wrong, fact or true standard. These people are in fact entertainers, and they are just expressing opinions.
Yeah. But let me switch the lens a little bit, because I like where this is going a lot. But, we're all saying here that these are businesses that operate on revenue. They have a bottom line. They need to keep that bottom line. So from one perspective, the question then becomes, what's the responsibility of businesses in sending these advertising dollars to these companies if what you're saying is really the case? A lot of this is opinion-based news, but I know if I want to sell a pickup truck, I probably should go one place. If I want to sell a hybrid, maybe I should go somewhere else, right? So, so what are your views on the responsibility of the business community in this new landscape?
Well, I think, it's something. Sorry, Michael, go ahead.
Go ahead, Ray. Now go ahead.
When
Please.
You've been in the newspaper business for a long time, the power of advertisers. There's one reason why you hardly ever would read stories in a newspaper about car dealers and some of their practices. You do a story like that and they yank their ads. I've seen it happen. I watched a friend of mine who ran a series of weekly papers in Florida scramble over a week after one of his reporters did a story that he didn't know about that savaged some car dealer for a legitimate story, and they lost all their advertising. So the advertisers in a lot of cases do have that influence, and it can be pretty scary. And that's why you don't see people do certain kinds of stories.
Right. Just as a footnote there before I turn back over to Kurt, when it comes to television, were it not for the military and car advertisements, television would require a different advertising model. Yeah,
no doubt.
Yeah. That's a great point. And I think too, how, again, technology has kind of changed some of this, where before Twitter, you wouldn't necessarily know or be able to easily obtain with one click who's advertising every night on Fox, CNN, MSNBC, et cetera. Now, and we saw this happen with Tucker Carlson show, if something that's deemed offensive, inappropriate, whatever, really bothers people, they start a campaign on social media, and those advertisers get targeted and listed, and a campaign begins to get them to pull their ads. And we saw with Tucker show that happened even more. I think one of the most powerful advertising campaigns of the last 4 years was the campaign to defund Breitbart effectively. When Trump won and Steve Bannon went to the White House, this anonymous account called Sleeping Giants began targeting every single one of Breitbart's advertisers, and virtually every single one of them pulled their ads from Breitbart. And they were in serious financial jeopardy, and they still are. But the power of social media has created a certain amount of citizenship citizen activism that's geared towards corporate responsibility. And the one thing, if you are a corporation and a private enterprise that is putting ad dollars in a certain place, you need to be mindful of what content that destination is promoting, and at least be aware that it could very quickly blow back on you, and you need to be geared to have a response for that. Because as we've seen with social media, it can happen in one day. You can go from anonymous, just private enterprise trying to sell a product to, in the heart of the resistance Twitter feed, trying to get you to pull your ad money from, Rupert Murdoch's company.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's hard to know, Christina, in response to your question, what is the responsibility of those companies? In some sense, when I was in law school, I learned that the responsibility of a corporation is to its shareholders, and that ultimately it was not there to offer political or social opinions, but rather to generate value for those people who have invested in the company. So if you take that point of view, they should advertise in the place that will generate the most revenue for their companies. But it's not that simple, obviously, because if where you're generating your revenue are in places that are deemed to be offensive by one side or the other of this opinion war that's going on, you need to have a public relations firm. You need to have Richard standing by as if your ship hits the rock and oil starts spilling out. These cataclysmic events that occur as a result of badly placed advertisement, an advertisement that either the content is deemed to be offensive, whether you intended it to be so or not, or it's on a show like Carlson where he says things which are outlandish, and then there's the blowback about it. So you need, in some sense, as these corporations, you always think of strategic communications as being there when the Exxon Valdez hits the rock. But really, you now have to have strategic communications departments who are ready to respond to advertisements that hit the rock with perhaps the same, if not greater, negative impact on your bottom line.
If I can add one thing with regard to a lot of these primetime shows that tend to be more editorial as opposed to news programs, and you're getting a right-wing view and left-wing view based on which show you're watching. It really doesn't boil down to, is that fact or fiction? Is it news or entertainment? It's really boils down to follow the money. And obviously news organizations will air where the content that their viewers want to watch. And these advertisers will advertise where they feel as though their customers support that. And it's not been until the cancel culture has gotten into to play, where people like Kurt mentioned that come up and stand up to these companies and say, we're going to stop shopping at your car dealership, or we're going to stop buying your soft drink because you advertise on this show. And when businesses and companies see loss of revenue based on their support for a specific news show, whether it's a entertainment or a news program, those businesses will continue to advertise on Hannity until they feel the pinch from their customers. And same goes for those that advertise on Rachel Maddow. It's really about, the money aspect from the advertising standpoint and the news side.
Can I add one thing about that, which is, I think maybe a little bit different in the Trump administration than my experience in previous administrations. But in interviewing recently Brian Stelter about his book Hoax and the relationship between the Trump administration and Fox News, what he reports in the book is how advertisers are trying to communicate with the president through the news outlet. So there is an overt effort on the part of some companies to essentially sell their message or their product or whatever to the administration through a news outlet. Now, it may be true that if you sell a pickup truck versus a hybrid, you may choose your station, but there is this according to Brian, this phenomenon of directly trying to communicate with political leaders through, especially the president, through Fox, and that's a very dangerous proposition. Although Brian said to advertisers, be forewarned, Trump sort of TiVos everything, and he sort of zips through the commercial. So your best laid strategy may be TiVo'd right through it. But regardless, there is that, which I think is really terrible.
That is one of the most unique things about this time, because I can tell you, wearing my Lincoln Project hat, we buy specific ad time during Fox and Friends in Washington, D.C. only, to run a spot that we know is going to drive him crazy, that he'll obsess about, and then he'll tweet about or rant about at a rally. And again, it's the occupying just that one person's headspace. And it's such a, I can't imagine any other time or any other president where you could actually do that and have it work, that you could buy a 30-second ad spot on Fox DC and know that the president of the United States is actually going to see it, consume it, and react to it, all within a day. That is, that's not a good thing, I don't think, but it is effective. And if you're an advocacy group or a company trying to sell, if I were a pharmaceutical company that had the next vaccine, I'd buy airtime on Fox and Friends right now, because that he's going to see it and he's going to talk about it.
I could just follow up on that for folks that, for whatever reason, not familiar with the Lincoln Project. To Kurt's point, y'all might spend a lot of ad money buying ads on television, but you are living rent-free in this president's head. So that is money well spent.
Christine, is this where we have to be fully transparent and say that this program is being brought to you by TiVo?
Yes, exactly.
So a number of you keep talking about the media and capitalistic model. Let's go back. It's not very long ago. I know it feels prehistoric, but to the mid 80s. I had my heart broken as a young adult thinking that Hollywood was like the museums. They were here to bring us art and entertainment, only to find out later, no, it's all about profit. And the news used to be a public service. We had a fairness doctrine and equal time. And is it just technology that makes that impossible, or is it the absence of political will so that, Kurt, to your point, we would name the difference between fact and entertainment before litigation? And to Alice, your point about people being able to be smart consumers, that's always easy for all of us to say, but we make our living off of information. We're used to being able to separate the wheat from the chaff. For most, it is just a pastime. And how can we help them be better citizens?
I've always felt, that the people, the public, they have more power than they realize, and more power than they're sometimes willing to use. I think about movies. I'm a big movie buff. I love watching movies. And every time I see a bad film, I think to myself, someone sat in a room and greenlit this multi-million-dollar project that absolutely sucks. It's terrible. And everybody knows it's terrible. Yet they're going to make a profit on this movie somehow. If people would stop seeing bad movies, I guarantee you the studios would stop making them. But they don't, because they keep making money out of it. I equate that to the quality of news. Ultimately, if the American people collectively decided to only watch high quality, well-produced, thorough news, you cannot wrap your arms around the complexities of most of the topics we debate in a freaking 5-minute segment with 4 people talking for 30 seconds in the formulaic way that we all, Alice and I particularly have to engage in every day. But if the audience demanded a more thorough and in-depth news and stopped watching, this news porn that we have that we're kind of all a part of, people would stop making it and would adapt. As much as I do believe that news organizations certainly have almost a fiduciary responsibility to the American public, because we gave them the airways for free to do high quality journalism, tell the truth, report the facts. I also think that, the American people bear some responsibility too. Ratings, it just came out the other day, all-time highs across for Fox News, for MSNBC, CNN, most viewers they've ever had ever. And you can make the case that the quality of the actual content is nothing short of just political porn. If the ratings weren't so good and people weren't making so much money, they would have to change. They would be forced to change how they do it. So in my opinion, things aren't going to get better until the people, the audience, the consumers demand it so and act accordingly.
Well, I think there's a big difference between TV and what we'll call print, which is now mostly online. I think TV is broken. Cable news is broken. You don't really see any reported stories on any of the three major cable news outlets, CNN, MSNBC, Fox. You see some little tidbit, and then you got 4 people in the studio, or some days on CNN, you got like 15 people in the studio pre-COVID, and they're talking about something that you only just got a shred of. And that's tremendously damaging. And then you talk about what's traditionally called print journalism, which is a media model that is broken. It's just in tatters with a few exceptions, the New York Times, Washington Post, maybe the Wall Street Journal, where they don't know how to make money anymore. You're not getting any advertising. You're not getting any subscriptions because people don't think they need to pay for news. And so every year you have fewer and fewer people doing that actual work, which makes the remaining people have to chase faster and faster to get clicks and do whatever, and there's less time to do good journalism. It's a scary model.
If I can just briefly weigh in on that, in defense of, I think CNN and Fox and MS and a lot of them, as I said before, there are good, darn good journalists at all of these news outlets, and they do report, fairly and accurately, all the time. But a lot of what we're seeing in media has been, the term, the USA Today version. Everything is shorter and briefer and kind of in bite-sized pieces for viewers. And clearly the model that a lot of these cable outlets subscribe to is, provide the reporting content and put a lot of it online. A lot of people go to CNN.com or FoxNews.com and read the full-length stories online. But in terms of what works on the air, it's more of a discussion that people, the viewers like to see. Okay, give us a Cliff Notes version of the news and let's kind of analyze it. But I do think that all of the news outlets really do a good job of putting all the information online. And then when you want like a more of a conversation driven aspect of the news, that's kind of the role that what we see on television.
Except for public television, of course, because public television does operate much more closely to that long form conversation model. As does BBC operate on a longer form conversation model, as does a few shows. Fareed Zakaria's show is a long form conversation. The question, though, is one of the attention span of the public and whether they're willing to invest the time to learn of this. I remember at CNN when they were sending reporters down to the border, when families were being separated and children were being caged, and all of their reporters, and not just CNN, everybody had their people on covering it like a hurricane, and it was compelling television. But where is the follow-up? I mean, the people are still being separated. The children are still in cages. We heard in the last debate that 500 plus kids are stranded without any knowledge of where their parents are. But you don't see that continuing story being addressed. They've moved on, and that I'm not so sure that I accept the editorial responsibility for. I think that they have a duty to continue to be sort of at the border. They have a duty to continue to follow on stories so that one doesn't have to answer, I wonder whatever happened to, which is where I find myself all the time. Remember that story that we heard about? I wonder whatever happened to, and there isn't that sort of long thread through the news, which I think is unfortunate.
Well, I think a big part of that comes down to the fact that you are losing more and more people in the business, and that if you have editors and reporters who are focused on following through on a story, they'll keep doing it. I know a lot of people like that. I tried to do that as well. Let's not lose sight of the border crisis because it's no longer in the news, and let's bring it back as we can. And a lot of times the imperatives of the news industry are that you don't have a chance to do that. But if you want to do it, you can find a way to do it. It's just really difficult.
Yeah, I do think that's one of the real challenges uniquely to the Trump presidency, which is the urgent tends to crowd out the important. That there is just, and believe me, they know that and they prey upon that. The Trump administration does, in my opinion. They are counting on the fact that whatever outrageous thing that the president says, does, or lies about today, you'll forget about tomorrow because he will say something undoubtedly more outrageous than the thing he just said the day before. And it becomes almost impossible to have any type of consistency in following one thread because we are all, and Trump has played this masterfully to his credit for the last 4 years, chasing the next crazy thing that he says and does. We have never recalibrated, and I'm speaking more from a TV standpoint in this case, but we have never recalibrated how we covered Donald Trump since he came on the political scene. When he tweets something crazy, like I said, we're out there on Morning Joe, we're putting the tweet up, we're reading it, we're reacting to it. In part because it's good for our show that the president is watching and tweeting about it. It creates visibility, it creates eyeballs, it creates a certain status that the most powerful man in the world is watching and reacting to our show in real time. But is it good? Is it healthy for democracy? Is it creating any real value? That's certainly up for debate. And a question I actually had for Ray, being an editor particularly. One of the real changes, in the last decade has been how many journalists are now on TV and how many journalists get, exclusive deals and contributorships with various networks. And I wonder, I remember coming up just as a consumer of news, you would read the bylines, but you didn't know them. You didn't see them. You couldn't necessarily, put a face with them and feel like you have that day-to-day touch point that we do now. Has that been good or bad for journalism that now reporters are sometimes put in a position to also be prognosticators and pundits on TV?
Well, it can be a problem if you have a reporter who's covering a straight beat going on TV and offering opinion. Then you have to have a come to Jesus talk with that reporter and say, don't do that. I've not experienced that with the reporters I've worked with who have been on TV. You have to use it to enhance the reporting that you do, that make sure that, they're still out there doing original reporting and then, bolstering that reporting with a TV appearance. One of the reporters who worked closely with me in the last few years was Heidi Bardella, who's now at NBC. Yeah. She would do a story, she would go on TV, she would talk about that story, and people would call and tell her more stuff. And that's the way it's supposed to work. A lot of times, though, and at least traditionally, you didn't want people going on TV because it's a control issue. Mm-hmm. They're on TV, they have a different outlet, they have a different audience. You can no longer control everything they do. It didn't bother me because, look, this business is harsh. Your employer will demand loyalty and then get rid of you the next day because their numbers didn't add up. So it's pretty much every person for themselves. But if you realize that there are benefits to have, your people going on TV and how can you work that with what you're doing in your regular job, I think it really does work well.
I can think of another, just real quick, another colleague of yours that's managed to navigate those two areas is Susan Page. She does a great job reporting, giving the facts, but she is on television quite a bit, but she always manages to make sure that her commentary is based on the facts of her reporting and doesn't, pick a side. And obviously the fact that she was granted the opportunity to moderate the vice presidential debate is a big kudos to her for being able to be a objective journalist, but also be able to communicate with different audiences of people.
Absolutely.
So I have a question for the seasoned journalists here, of which I don't consider myself one. One of the things that I, in watching the news, remark on and follow up to this conversation is many journalists now are becoming celebrities. They have their Twitter following and their Instagram, and so they've become celebrity in and of themselves, almost independent of their reporting. They become personalities, and something about that makes me a little bit queasy. I can't articulate what it is that I think degrades the profession of journalism with media star journalists. But I was wondering, maybe Ray, since you've been at this longer than many here, how do you see, how is that playing out?
Well, I think, if you have people who are on TV a lot and they have less time to do their actual reporting jobs, that can be a problem. If you're looking to shape kind of an overall, institutional voice, that can also be a challenge. People can get bigger than the organization, but I think that's something that's happened over the years. It's just in a different shape now than it used to be. I mean, I mentioned earlier David Halberstam at the New York Times. He got to be a big deal. He wrote books. And then, he left the New York Times. He went to Harper's Magazine. He became a full-time author. You've seen it, lately with Nate Silver in 538 at the New York Times, became a big deal. Now he's off doing his own thing. I think that's just the free enterprise system and the tensions that we have. And I think it requires a creativity on the part of the individual journalists and the people who manage them, how to make it work for you as best you can for as long as you can.
Well, let me dive in there, Ray, if I can, with a closing question as we're wrapping up. You said, it's up to the free enterprise system. Let's assume, arguendo, that next week, and I know this may come as news to some of you. I know it was shocking to me. There's an election next Tuesday. I don't know if any of you had heard. And let's assume, arguendo, that there's a blue wave. Democrats take the Senate and they take the White House in addition to the House. Certainly, they're going to be looking at any number of different reforms, from healthcare to gerrymandering issues at the state level, et cetera, et cetera. But is it also possible that they look at things like the fairness doctrine? They look at things like Section 230, which treats the large tech companies, which have more power than any individual media, to influence not only what we buy, but what we think, and certainly the outcomes of elections, and look at those and change liability issues. There are many things that end up being technical issues that have either the intended or unintended consequence to unmake capitalism, democracy, and a well-ordered society. So what do you think you either might suggest or might be possible changes if we were to radically alter a system that you all admit is broken?
I think we're seeing some of that right now as we speak. Big tech companies, Facebook, Twitter, and these social media companies, they're getting their butts chewed out because they can't seem to make up their mind if they want to be platforms or publishers. And I think it's a need of change. Look, when you have these Twitter or Facebook, whichever these social media outlets, when they are protected under Article 230 by the content that they put out there because they're publishers, and then they decide to pick and choose what they want to fact check, they no longer have that protected status. So I think it's not just a Republican thing or a Democrat thing. It's an issue that whoever the next president is really needs to take a hard look at social media and how they are delivering information or misinformation. And some people say, only Republicans want that because certain stories are being blocked. But I think it's beneficial to all consumers of information online to make sure that these social media companies are fair across the board. And really, they're going to be a platform, be that, or if they're going to be publishers, they're going to have a whole different level of scrutiny.
Yeah, this is one of those areas where, for kind of different reasons, there's actually some sort of bipartisan consensus that something needs to change, that more regulations need to be put in place or laws need to be updated to reflect the times that we live in right now. Like I said, Republicans believe that there's an inherent social media bias against them. Democrats believe that the idea that pervasively fake news can be trafficked and people can be manipulated by foreign enterprises and to contaminate the American electorate, the fact that that can happen largely unchecked, that's a problem. And so we've already seen that in the Democrat wave, I expect that a person to watch, and all that will be Senator Elizabeth Warren. She's already, looked at introducing legislation to start addressing some of this. I think that there is, everyone kind of acknowledges that this is a problem. I don't think there's necessarily consensus on the solution, but this is the only issue I can think of outside of maybe the coronavirus, where both Republicans and Democrats agree that there is a problem and we need to fix it. And I think that that's one of the areas that you actually can see some sort of bipartisanship on next year.
Right.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. I think, big tech has a lot of different problems. I don't think it has an inherent bias against conservatives, because whenever I look at Facebook, I see a lot of conservative content out there. But basically, a lot of these companies have been taking product from media organizations and using it for free. And they're not paying for it. And it's part of the reason why the news industry is just getting pounded financially, while they're getting richer and richer and richer and don't seem to care. And, something that I've been particularly sensitive about for a long time. And, they know what they're doing and they know where they're getting their money, and they don't really seem to care about what happens. And I think people on both sides of the aisle are looking at that and going, something needs to change. You look at what's happening now with the pandemic. These companies are making more and more money than ever before. And I think a lot of times they leave their social responsibility behind.
Michael, do you want to get the last word, and then we'll turn it over to Christina?
Well, no, I don't disagree with anything anyone has said, but with the asterisk that I worry about censorship, and I worry about who makes the value judgments about what is, news and what is reportable, and what is a platform versus what is not. I would not like, for example, the current administration, because I disagree with their views on many issues, be the arbiter of what is acceptable for these social media companies to put out there. So yeah, we can reach broad consensus about a lot of these things until you get to the details of what is the remedy. And Richard and I have been on shows before, and I've told him that my personal remedy is, I'm not on social media. I don't tweet. I don't Instagram. I have a Facebook page that one of my kids set up for me long ago. I post, music videos that I like, but I just don't participate in that mechanism for communication. But I'm clearly an outlier, and nobody's going to follow my lead. But that's what worries me, is First Amendment censorship and who writes the rules. And I'm not so sanguine that whether it's Elizabeth Warren or Jared Kushner, that I'll like the outcome of the proposed solution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely something we all want to be very concerned and active about. And it sounds to me a little bit like, Kurt, if the Lincoln Project is looking for a next project, we might all get together and see if we can ignore Facebook and make it go away. If we just ignore it, maybe it'll go away.
If I never had to get on social media ever again, I would be so happy to be able to do that. But what Ray said was important, and it's true, because it's the same conundrum that in the music business that I work in. We're having the same problem with streaming. It's like streaming killed the music album, where publishers and writers and artists are not being fairly compensated for the amount of content that is being used by platforms like Spotify or Amazon Music. And there's been no solution to that, and the result is it's killing the industry, which in my opinion is bad for the consumer. It's bad for the artist. It's bad just for the creative culture. And I think the same thing is happening in journalism, where when people have license to use your content and not compensate those creators, and it creates a massive revenue vacuum that ends up with less quality journalism because they have less resources. And the real entities that have been hit hardest by this are local news, the news that's supposed to be closest to the people, that's supposed to tell you what's going on in your community, your backyard, your city, and your state, they have less resources. So many newsrooms have had to close and downsize. And that also has another reverberation effect on the quality of the informed consumer.
Mhm. Richard, last thoughts?
I just want to thank our panel, terrific, engaging, and stay tuned for hour 2, as clearly we have so much more to talk about. So, thank
Yes.
you, Christina.
Yeah, it's thank you again, and thank you to everyone at Wake Forest for joining us today. We'll be back in a few weeks when we have a panel on financing litigation and new models behind that trend. So until then, thanks again to all the panelists for joining us today for this thoughtful conversation, and we'll look forward to following you all as you provide us with important news about the next weeks and months of the American system. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.